photographs, toys ranging from the 1880s to the 1950s, because I remember a few of them, as well as some of the garments and outfits that kids wore back in the day. So Thursday afternoons from 2 to 4, if you'd like to come in, it's just a delightful exhibit, and the second Sunday of every month. Okay, well, I'm chairman of the program committee, and with the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, we've been trying to have a Civil War program every year. And when the committee met last year, we were trying to decide what to do. And Connie Satin, who was on the committee, said, I have just the person. It's Dave Smith. He does a great job. I think he'd be wonderful. So I got a hold of Dave. Here he is today. He is served our country as a Marine. He is the child of a railroad man. And as he told me, he grew up with the Cinders. So he brings a love of history and a military background to an awareness of the whole value and importance of rail travel. So without further ado, Mr. Smith, take it away.
We back? Very good, fine. This is a great turnout. Thank you very much. I'll try to make it well worth your while. I told somebody earlier in the day that this is perfect weather for a speaker. Just enough rain so you can't do the lawn, but not enough to keep you from driving over. So thank you for coming. I've called the Civil War railroads a new technology. In a sense, it was a 30-year technology for the United States, but that wasn't true for the rest of the world. In 1515, Germans were running animal-pulled carts on rails, not iron rails like railroads, but probably wooden rails. That cut down on the friction and allowed the animals to pull larger loads and so forth. We saw our first iron tracks in 1804 in the mines in Wales. Another good use for them. At that point, they were still being pulled by animals, but somebody said, hey, we got these steam engines here that Mr. Watt has invented to pump the water out of the mines. Maybe we could put one of those small steam engines on rails and pull the carts. And thereby, the railroads were invented in about 1804. They could go at the dizzying speed of 9 miles an hour. Wow, it's wonderful. In 1826, the first iron rails came to the United States in a Quincy, Massachusetts quarry. Again, animal power. They were quarrying stone out of there for the Bunker Hill Monument. That was the first use of it in the United States. 1830 came and two railroads were actually started. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, leaving Baltimore, heading west for the Ohio River. And the other was called the Charleston and Hamburg Railroad. We'll talk a little bit about that later. The two engines you see on here, the best friend of Charleston was on the Charleston and Hamburg, and the Tom Thumb was on the B&O. Unfortunately, the best friend wasn't the best friend for very long. Before the railroad was completed, it blew up. This is what railroading looked like in 1831. As you can see, it takes its first shape from the previous modes of transportation, buggies and stagecoaches and wagons and that sort of thing. However, it didn't take long before it evolved and began looking more like the modern railroads. Here's a quick step up. You can see the best friend. Now a lot of people have asked me, where the heck is Hamburg? The Charleston and Hamburg. Why would anyone build a railroad from Charleston, South Carolina, out here to a little place called Hamburg? Well, if you know your geography, you know that that's the Savannah River right there. And so it's right across the river from Augusta, Georgia, on the Savannah River. And people shipping cotton and other products downriver for export could now, once that railroad was completed, stop there, unload their cargo in Hamburg, and ship it over to the port of Charleston to have it shipped out. This was a kind of a pirate railroad. It was the way that Charleston was trying to steal commercial traffic from Savannah, Georgia. Now, between 1850 and 1860, the railroads boomed. In 1850, only 9,000 miles of track. By 1860, 31,000 miles of track. That is a huge, huge undertaking. 334% increase. 22,000 miles of it, 71% was in the north. 9,000 miles of it, 29% in the south. And the telegraph line distances was even greater, 45,000 in the north, only 5,000 in the rural agricultural south. It was the largest, by that time, the largest, but not the best railroad system in the world. The quantitative part of it was that sometimes they cut corners putting this stuff up. It wasn't as well built as the railroads in England and the railroads on the continent were beginning to be. That 9,000 miles in the south doesn't look like much when it's compared to the north, but if the south had been at that time a standalone nation, it would have been the fourth largest system in the world. So it's pretty clear that railroads were made to order for this large country that we were trying to tame. People say that the Compromise of 1850 was absolutely necessary because neither side was in a position to fight the war. The railroads hadn't been built yet. 10 years later, the railroads had been built, so we were able to go ahead and fight the war. Now, we think of the railroads as facilitating its uses during the war, but it was also used to achieve secession in South Carolina. You notice that the Charleston and Hamburg now has a branch that goes up to Columbia, and they were just finishing up in 1860 the Charleston and Savannah Railroad, which ran from base off just north of Charleston to Savannah, Georgia. When the railroad was completed, there was a big celebration, and all of the people in South Carolina came over on the train down to Savannah, and they had a big dinner and a big celebration. As is the case in those days, they began having some toasts. And if you had drinking enough of those things, you believe that what you're saying. One man got up, a man named Francis Barcode got up, and he said, "We will defend South Carolina, rash though we think her, precipitate though we deem her, with all of the energy and courage of a brother." Now that was a great boom for the South Carolinian secessionists, because they wanted out of the Union. And here's a prominent Georgian saying, "We think you're a little crazy, but we'll go ahead and go along with you." But the South Carolinians kind of looked at this and they said, "Hey, maybe we can make use of this railroad." So before the end of the evening, they said, "Y'all are invited back. We're going to have a big party back in South Carolina on the 6th of November. And we'd love y'all have you all come back, and we'll drink some more toast and have another good time." They did that at the Mills House, and with 77 Georgians and 123 South Carolinians. And again, Mr. Barcode.
I'm sorry. I don't think the microphone is either on or it's not close enough to your mouth.
There you go. Okay, there it is. Okay.
Thank you.
I'll remember to keep my thumb on it there. Again, he got up and said, "Since the storm is to come, as I know it must, be its fury so great, I court it now in the days of my vigor and strength. I am ready for it, put it off no longer, we will not be any stronger for waiting." So again, the Georgians are encouraging the South Carolinians. The South Carolinians don't need much encouragement because they want to secede anyway. The South Carolinians finally stepped off and seceded on their own. Up until that time, there had been an argument whether the South should all secede together in cooperation, or whether each state should secede separately and then get together after that. South Carolina, they couldn't get the decision made. South Carolina jumped, but they had used the railroad to do it. Now, military use of railroads. The technology was so new that military leaders had no training or experience at all. It had never been, nobody had ever used a railroad in a war. They had allowed for, pretty obvious, it would allow for greater dispersal of troops and more rapid redeployment, because you can't keep all of your soldiers shoulder to shoulder all the time. You've got to spread them out, especially when you have to feed them and all the other problems. So the railroads allowed them to spread the troops out and then bring them together more rapidly. They were able to move greater volumes of supplies and faster. They presented a target, of course, for both sides. Each side's railroad became a target, and it also called for defense. And it also dictated where battles would be fought, because that's where the soldiers would be, along the railroad lines. Now, at the time of the Civil War, there were five major east-west railroads. The New York Central out of Albany to Buffalo and eventually on to Chicago. The Erie Railroad across the southern tier of New York out to Lake Erie. The Pennsylvania Railroad from Harrisburg out to Pittsburgh in the Ohio River. The Baltimore and Ohio from Baltimore through Harper's Ferry to Wheeling and Parkersburg on the Ohio River. And the Memphis and Charleston, which ran, and this one, they always sketch it from the west to east. It ran east from Memphis to Chattanooga. Then it split with lines going to Norfolk, to Atlanta, and eventually out of Atlanta to Charleston and Savannah, and another line down to Pensacola. Those east-west lines were really the key to how the strategy would be, the wartime strategy would work. The three that are listed in blue up there were safe from, far enough and safe from the Confederate forces, so the Union could use those lines without worry. The Baltimore and Ohio, as you know, Maryland never seceded, but the area around Harper's Ferry was a battleground for most of the war, so the Union struggled to try to keep control of that line. The Memphis and Charleston should have been safely in Confederate hands, but very early in the war, the North worked its way down in the western states to take over part of that line at Corinth, Mississippi, and we'll talk a bit about that. Now, the strategic centers, where were these hotspots? Well, Corinth, Mississippi is a definite key spot. Let's see if I can pick it up here. It's right here. And it's where the Memphis and Charleston and the Baltimore and Ohio railroads cross. And anybody who controlled Corinth, Mississippi pretty much controlled the railroad systems, the two major railroad systems in the West. Chattanooga, Tennessee, and again, it's right up here, also major railhead. Manassas Junction, Virginia, up in this area, was another major key point. Atlanta, Georgia, and finally Petersburg and Richmond, Virginia. These would be the hot spots. Whoever controlled those areas was going to control the war. Early in the war, the railroads were in place, and the various states used the rail lines to move their troops to the centers of the war, to Washington, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Cairo, Illinois, for the North. And the Confederates were sending troops to Charleston, Northern Virginia, Pensacola, and Pensacola, Florida. Those were the key points. there was relatively little gouging, only a little bit. And the Railroad and Telegraphy Act of January 31, 1862, gave the Union the right to seize the railroads and the telegraph lines if they needed them. So that guaranteed cooperation by the railroads because they didn't want to see that happen. So the railroads were very cooperative in the North almost immediately. However, the South did not give that authority until much, much later in the war to their people. Now, the shortcomings of the Southern railroad systems, mostly they were shorter lines. There was a lot of gauge variety. Does everybody understand gauge? It's how far apart the rails are on the rail bed. And at that time, there were half a dozen or more different gauges commonly in use. And the current standard wasn't adopted in the North until late in the war, but most of the North used the standard gauge. The 29% of the track, the South had 29% of the country's track, but they only had 20% of the traffic. They didn't use the lines quite as much. There were very few lines that connected. It would not at all be unusual for, let's say, a line coming down from Providence to New London. And it wouldn't connect with the line that went from New London to New Haven. And that line, and the New Haven line wouldn't connect to the one going down to New York or Bridgeport or wherever. The reason for that was very simple. The people who built the railroad were the people from the city, from that city. And they wanted their city to be financially successful. So they didn't want people just riding through. That wasn't going to help. They wanted them to come to the city. They would have to then get off the train. Since the next train on the other line was probably tomorrow, they'd have to stay overnight in a hotel, buy some meals, spend some money. And it also kept the teamsters and the baggage handlers and so forth all properly busy. So that was by design, not having those railroads connect. I think Richmond had 5 railroads coming into it, none of them connected. Once the war started, they took the 2 most active lines and ran tracks right down the middle of Main Street so that they could be connected. The 100 plus companies in the South, but less than 90 miles of track per line. They relied on Northern technology and Northern skilled workers. And we're going to talk about a little bit about why that wasn't necessarily a good idea. When the war came, of course, many of those Northerners went home. But the ones who managed to stay on were often suspected of not being fully Southerners. And the biggest railroad center in the South was Baltimore, Maryland. They had huge railroad yards and railroad facilities. They built engines there and so forth. But Baltimore was kept in the Union during the war, so the South never got to use it. Confederate arrangements. The Southern railroads stayed in private hands. 2 cents per mile per man for troops. 1/2 of the local rate for military supplies. They had to accept Confederate bonds at par, and as the war progressed, par got worse and worse. They allowed a draft exemption of 1 man per mile to maintain and run the railroad. That wasn't enough. And it wasn't until 1865 that they gave the Confederates military the right of seizure. Now, enter one of my favorite Civil War characters, Ben Butler, cross-eyed lawyer from Massachusetts, one of the most controversial men in the war, we could talk about him all day. When the mob shut down, they attacked the 6th Massachusetts in Baltimore. The 6th Massachusetts was one of his 4 regiments. He was a brigadier general, a militia brigadier general. And one of his regiments had been attacked. A couple of his regiments had already gone down to Fort Monroe in Virginia. That regiment was going down to Washington and finally did get there, a little of the worse for wear. Butler was behind them coming out of Pennsylvania with the last of the 4 regiments. When he discovered that Baltimore effectively was shut down by the mob action, he said, okay, how can I get to Washington without going through Baltimore? So he took a train down to Perryville on the Susquehanna River and commandeered a large railroad ferry boat that took the cars across to the Maryland side. He put his people on the ferry boat and went down to Annapolis. He had read years before that Annapolis is the natural harbor for Washington. You'd think Washington being on the Potomac, sailing up the Potomac would be the wise move, but it isn't, because the Potomac is narrow and the Confederates had guns already implanted on the Potomac River, so getting up the Potomac looked like it wasn't going to work out well. He went into Baltimore, into Annapolis, into the Naval Academy there. The old commandant of the academy was petrified because he was in an area that might fall into Confederate hands. And he had old Ironsides, the USS Constitution, that was the training ship there. And he was very worried about that. And when Butler arrived, he came out to Butler and shook his hand, and he said, "Are you here to save the Constitution?" Butler didn't catch his meaning, and he said, "Well, I guess so, you know." But then he discovered it was the ship. Anyway, Butler took over. There's a railroad line that goes back to the Baltimore and Ohio and then down into Washington. And he took over there, repaired the line. They found an engine in one of the warehouses that had been disabled, but he had a man in his regiment, one of his companies, who had worked on those engines, and the guy was able to put it into working shape. And they opened the line down to Washington. That was very important because they were very concerned that Washington would be taken by the Confederates, and if the capital fell with the government and all to the Confederates, that was going to be a very bad way to start the war. So Butler is the hero of the day because he opens the line. Then Butler goes and he feigns as though he's going toward Harper's Ferry to a place called Point of Rocks. Instead, brings his train into Baltimore with a couple of regiments on it. In a very heavy rain, thunderstorm, they march up on Federal Hill, which is up over the harbor. He implants his cannon there, and the next morning, the mob that had mobbed his people and was controlling Baltimore found themselves under his guns. Baltimore got very peaceful, became a very peaceful place almost immediately, and Butler had not only kept the line open to Washington, but it had to save the day with good use of railroads, again, note. Stonewall Jackson gets into the act. He's only a colonel in the Virginia militia, but he's in control of Harper's Ferry. And the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad goes through there. Well, he says to the people running the railroad, "You can't run in here all night. It's keeping my troops awake. You know, they're not getting their sleep. You can only run here through the middle of the day." And he kept shortening it. Every day or two, he'd shorten it. Finally, he got about half of the rolling stock of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in about a 10-mile stretch, and then he pulled the plug on them, and destroyed 14 locomotives, captured and sent south, 42 locomotives, and sent 14 more south. They pulled those engines across country roads with 40-horse teams, pulling them on kind of sleds. And the 386 cars captured, 6.5 miles of track, 25 bridges, 102 miles of telegraph, and put the B&O out of business for about 10 months, thereby showing that this fellow Jackson was going to be a bit of a problem for the Union. Now, the Virginia Railroad system, I think it's important to understand it. The first line is called Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac. And it comes up here to Fredericksburg and then comes over to a place called Aquia on the. Then there's the Virginia Central, which comes out of Richmond, comes over here, and eventually ends up over in Stanton and Lexington, over in the Shenandoah Valley. This is the Orange and Alexandria, coming out of Alexandria and coming down. It shares track here and then eventually goes out past Lynchburg to the western part of the state. Those railroads were all used extensively to supply the Confederates or to supply the Union at various times. Robert E. Lee complained a great deal about the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac. He didn't think it was run very well. He was having trouble getting his supplies. One of the reasons for that was very simple. The superintendent was a man named Samuel Ruth, and he was a Union spy. So this was, again, a danger of employing Northerners to run the Southern railroads. The first Battle of Bull Run. I think many of you probably know that the Confederate were split. They had Joe Johnston over up in the Shenandoah Valley, and they had Pierre Beauregard. They had him at Manassas Junction. There's a railroad between them, the Manassas Gap Railroad. And a Union general named Patterson from Pennsylvania was supposed to keep Johnston where he was. But as soon as the Confederates found out that they were about to be attacked at Manassas, Johnston broke off contact with Patterson and put his troops on the trains heading back down to Manassas Gap. And when the Union Army got out to Bull Run, to the Manassas area, they found themselves attacking not just the troops under Beauregard, but the whole Confederate army. They were able to get enough men down there. And that's very significant because, number one, it's what they call interior lines. They had a shorter distance to travel. The Confederates had a shorter distance to travel and were able to bring their people together. And also, the Confederates, who you think of as being technologically not as advanced as the Union, used the technology and beat the Union effectively at their own game. They also built the first military railroad. This is the world's first military railroad. It goes from Manassas Junction on the Orange and Alexandria, and it comes up here to a supply base right outside Centerville. Well, why would they build such a short little run? Well, mud. The Virginia mud is hideous, and if you're trying to run wagons over dirt roads, wagons that weigh the ton, in the area of a ton, tons of just supplies, the area will get pretty muddy and pretty hard to work with quickly. So they put together a very quick railroad. I think it stretched, that's 5 miles on muddy roads. And they used some of the rails that Stonewall Jackson stole from the the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. It was built very lightly. It was finished in February of 1862, and it's destroyed March 9th when the Confederates decided to retreat. At that point, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad arrived and took their rails back. Now, I've talked a lot about railroads, and it certainly is much, if you're traveling overland, it certainly is the best way to go, but water transportation was still the best. This I've got up here as a sign in the U.S. Army Transportation Museum at Fort Eustis, Virginia. An Army cargoes, water transportation was critical. The cargo capacity of Western steamboats from 100 tons to 1,700 tons. And an Army supply officer calculated that an ordinary Ohio River steamboat of 500 tons could carry enough supplies for on one trip to subsidize an army of 40,000 men and 18,000 horses for nearly 2 days. That would be the equivalent of 5 freight trains pulling 10 cars each. So you're a little better off with the water. The water is just a little slower, but it's also safer. You can pull up track, you can't pull up river. So the water was a better deal where you had it. I'll also jump over this one pretty fast, but what it means generally is that somebody developed a very complicated mathematical formula, and what it says is that trains are 10 times more efficient than mules hauling freight. And a lot of people don't think about it, but a horse or a mule required his own rations. You think about, well, let him go eat some grass. Now, that won't cut it. Mules require less feed than horses. Horses require more grain than mules. They're more delicate, they break down more easily than mules. Sometimes they're more cooperative, but when you have to rely on animals pulling your wagons, it makes the supply thing bigger. Some of you may remember back to or may have read of the days of World War II. General Patton, with his armored divisions going across Europe, the biggest problem he had was running out of gas. That was his biggest problem. The same thing in the Civil War, it wasn't gas, it was hay. So this is what a typical engine looked like in those days. From the New Jersey company, the 440, here's the first 4 right here. These truck engines, truck wheels in the front. Then the next 4 are the driving wheels. There are no wheels back here under the back part of the engine, so that's why it's 440. Some engines would have trucks in back, but typically in that time, now the drive wheels obviously provide the locomotion, make the thing go. The front wheels basically are there to keep it on the track. Some of the railroads of Civil War era had some pretty tight turns in them because they have the engineering, and they could easily jump track, so these wheels in the front were supposed to overcome that. They could run it at night with their kerosene headlight. That must have been breathtaking. They had a bell and a whistle. Theoretically, it could go 60 miles an hour, but very seldom did they go that fast. Average, about 10 they pulled about 10 cars on an average. They burned coal or wood, and they'd run better on coal, but the wood was more plentiful. And they had 2-man crews, an engineer and a fireman. Now, I mentioned Corinth, Mississippi, and I love this picture. This is the Memphis and Charleston going east-west, and this is the Mobile and Ohio, Mobile and Ohio, headed north. When I was on my way to Korea in 1951 on a troop train, we passed over that very spot. It's where, even today, that's an important rail junction. The Battle of Shiloh that you've heard about was part of a campaign to take that rail stop in Corinth. And Henry Halleck finally did capture it, but after the Confederates had left. Nobody could hold that place for very long, and one of the reasons why was that the water was so bad there that they couldn't sustain troops, any large number of troops there for any time. Early in the war, the first Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, saw the need for railroad support. He had been president of a railroad, and he saw that they needed to coordinate the use of the lines and take over and run the southern railroads as they were captured, and to repair and improve captured lines, build new lines as needed, quickly repair damage done by the enemy, develop a professional workforce. Initially, when they tried to repair, they used the soldiers. Soldiers are lousy laborers because they really don't want to be doing that. That's not really what they want to be doing. And if you have to rely, they don't have the skills. So they developed a professional force, about 23,000 men. Now that would be a large infantry corps if you had all those men in the infantry. But the work was so important that they used a professional group. They had some prefabrication things that they used, and the General Daniel McCallum, whose picture is on that slide, had developed the trusses that they could take with them and quickly rebuild a bridge that had been damaged. And the Confederates saw how quickly they could repair, and so they said that the Yankees traveled with 2 bridges in their pockets. They used materials, whenever possible, used materials on or near the work site. The other thing that they did was, by the way, was that the patch-up job was strictly for speed. They wouldn't delay the opening of the line in order to make it better, or to, maybe it's going to fall down in a month, but then maybe again the Confederates are going to come in and wreck it next month. So speed was what they were going after. Herman Hopt, who was the number 2 man in the military railroad, set up a set of rules. No military officer can interfere with the running of the railroads. Supplies go forward only when needed. In other words, don't develop huge supply bases out there for the Confederates to come down and take over on you. Cars were loaded by anyone available, cooperation mandatory. When telegraph was not available, trains ran on a strict schedule, even if not fully loaded. And trains ran in convoys of 5 or 6 for security. Previously, of course, they would try to stretch the trains out, distance between trains out, in order for safety. But when you're possibly going to be under attack, it's better to have them close together. Now, when Grant was trying to take Vicksburg, he decided to send a man named Benjamin Grierson off on a raid through the center of Mississippi to try to confuse the Confederates, and he did that very well. That raid was the subject of a movie called The Horse Soldiers, which probably some of you have seen. It featured this Grierson, who's not really the real one. This is really the real Grierson. Grierson was kind of a funny guy. Before the war, he was a music man, somewhat like the Broadway show. He went around setting up bands in small towns, and he became a friend of Abraham Lincoln's and wrote some songs, some campaign songs for him. He seems a strange choice as a cavalry leader because he hated horses. As a boy, he'd been kicked in the head and face by a horse and seriously hurt. And he hated horses, but he did prove to be a very good cavalry leader. Notice, by the way, the uniform John Wayne is wearing. That's one of the Plains cavalry, post-Civil War cavalry. He wore those same uniforms. They wore those same uniforms in horse soldiers. They didn't. As long as it was blue, that was close enough for Hollywood. That's a map of the. You can see Vicksburg. We think about the river being important, but here's Vicksburg, and it's on the Southern Railroad, and the Central Mississippi is coming down right through here, and the Mobile and Ohio coming up here through Corinth. So a big piece of Grierson's job was to wreck some railroads so that the Confederates could not bring supplies in from Meridian, supplies or troops in from Meridian through Jackson while Grant was trying to capture Vicksburg. Even a relatively backward state like Mississippi had a pretty decent railroad system. The biggest troop movement of the war was pulled off by Braxton Bragg, the much maligned Braxton Bragg. He had a lot of critics. In July of 1862, he was in Mississippi and he wanted to be in Chattanooga. And unfortunately, the Union was in Corinth, so he couldn't use the line. And they had control of the Memphis and Charleston. So he put his troops on trains and they went further south. They moved 31,000 men, 776 miles, as far south as Mobile. It involved 10 railroads. He used the roundabout routes so that they could not be blocked. And he launched his invasion of Kentucky out of Chattanooga. That invasion ended with the drawn battle at Perryville, Kentucky. It is again surprising to see the largest troop movement by the Confederates, again, over their rickety railroads. Again, the Confederates took the train. Lee agreed after Gettysburg to send James Longstreet to reinforce Bragg in Chattanooga. Longstreet took 2 of his 3 divisions under Hood and Kershaw, plus his artillery. They went 800 miles in 12 days. The most remarkable thing about this was there had been rumors that Confederates were moving troops by train, but the Union never fully identified that point until they discovered that they were up against some of Lee's army down there in Chattanooga. Of course, they went through their own territory. They didn't go through any Union territory. About half of the troops arrived in time to tip the scales for the Battle of Chattanooga. Their attack blew through an accidental gap in the Union line and sent 2 Union corps in retreat back to Chattanooga. The 3rd Union Corps under General George Thomas held and saved the day, saved the army in effect. And Longstreet, after the battle, almost immediately got involved in the politics of the Western Army and got into a row with Bragg. But of course, everybody got into a row with Bragg at some point or another. Jeff Davis had to come down to referee, and he decided to send Longstreet home via Knoxville, tried to capture Knoxville. Unfortunately, he was unsuccessful in that. So the Confederates lost a lot of the value that they got from their victory at Chickamauga, but still the movement of those troops was quite an achievement. The Union countered by sending 2 corps under Joe Hooker. They went 1,200 miles from Washington to Chattanooga. They had to go somewhat more roundabout. It was a 12-day trip, but their average 100 miles a day was larger than Longstreet's had been. When they arrived, they were instrumental in ending the siege at Chattanooga, and eventually at sending the Confederates under Bragg in retreat back down into Georgia. So the Union very quickly overcame the benefit of the Battle of Chickamauga. Bragg resigned at that point and was replaced by Joe Johnston. Most battles and campaigns had railroad components, bringing in reinforcements, bringing up food and ammunition, faster removal of the wounded from the field to field hospitals. That saved a lot of lives. The early campaign in West Virginia was designed to protect the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And for Fredericksburg, the rail line from Aquia Creek to Falmouth, Virginia, was completed to allow for that campaign. And after the Gettysburg campaign, they made very quick repairs of 5 railroads that went into Gettysburg. This is what a hospital car looked like, a Union hospital car. You can see that the men are in relatively comfortable. That sure, up until that point, when they evacuated wounded, it was usually with wagons. And you can imagine a man who'd had his arm amputated and the agony that he was in, bouncing along country roads. But being able to put these men in a relatively cleaner environment and more comfortable environment probably saved a lot of lives. The Confederates also, but they improvised. They weren't able to build their own cars, but they did take the cars they had and adapt them. And you can see that they added ventilation, they put hay in there, straw in there for comfort, and they improved their situation quite a bit too. Not as much as the North. I'm going to kind of jump over Sherman's Atlanta campaign. Basically, they were following a railroad line. It was called the Western Railroad that ran from Chattanooga down to Atlanta and then split out from there to a couple of different locations. And Sherman was very patient and outmaneuvered Joe Johnston all the way to the outskirts of Atlanta. Now, the big problem that Sherman had, however, was that his supply line was very, very long. It was all by rail. The railroad came out of Louisville down to Nashville. Then they had the choice of using either of these lines, but most of the time to this. This is a place called Bridgeport, Alabama, and it came down to there and eventually into Chattanooga, and then the rail line came down here to Atlanta. Those of you who are good at geography probably have noticed a rather remarkable thing that's happened here, and that is Atlanta has drifted west and is now in Alabama. But since that time, I'm happy to report, since that time they've moved it back where it belongs. This is what happens when you make your own maps. That is something like 576 miles of supply line. And it was made to order for people like Nathan Bedford Forrest and the Confederate raiders, who were very good at trying to, hit soft targets and break up the lines. Therefore, Bedford Forrest had 20,000 men, and there were Union had 76,000 men guarding the rail line. That's how vulnerable it was. I'd mentioned gauge beforehand. The Louisville and Nashville was not the same gauge as the other railroads. It was a narrower gauge. And the U.S. Military Railroad Group converted it to standard gauge in 1 weekend. In 1 weekend. It's about 60 miles, I think. And they did it in 1 weekend. But as I point out to everybody, they only had to move one rail. They didn't have to move them both. So they, I'm going to go backward here. I was showing men in Forrest and Wheeler 5,000 each, 40,000 Union at key points. Morgan, John Hunt Morgan, who was one of the more feared Confederate raiders, they died with his slippers on. The Union cavalry, which was getting better and better as the war progressed, startled him when he was in his camp, and they came riding into his camp one morning. One of the troopers saw a man in his bed slippers sneaking out through the back garden and told him to stop. When he didn't, he shot him, and it turned out to be Morgan. So they lost Morgan, who was one of their betters. Earl Van Dorn was another of the cavalry leaders, and he got shot by a jealous husband at a place called Spring Hill, Tennessee. He was rather notorious reputation as a womanizer, and that caught up with him. Bedford Forrest probably should have been further east. Bedford Forrest probably should have been further east, but unfortunately, he couldn't get along with the Confederate leaders, so they moved him, and he was then ended up in Memphis against a relatively unknown fellow named Suey Smith. He beat him regularly, but it didn't matter. He was in the wrong place. They also ran heavily, the Union ran heavily defended trains in clusters. They used railroad monitors. Here's a picture of one of them. You can see they've armored plated some of the cars. The first such car, by the way, was designed by Robert E. Lee for use by the Confederates. When Sherman got to Atlanta, he didn't have enough troops to totally encircle Atlanta. It was too big. So how am I going to get those guys out of there? And what he did was cut the railroad lines. And when the fifth and last railroad line at Jonesboro was cut, the Confederates had to retreat, and Atlanta was his. The victory at Atlanta is very, very important because it probably got Abraham Lincoln reelected. It caused a surge of confidence in the North, and if they had held out until after the election, it's hard to say. Possibly McClellan might have beaten Lincoln. Sherman cut loose from Atlanta, took the best of everything with him, and left George Thomas and Schofield here to battle with John Bell Hood. Fortunately, that worked out well, but it was taking a big chance. Once Sherman was in Savannah, then it was a matter of time. He started moving his troops north. One of my favorite little stories on on Sherman moving north. They came into Durham, North Carolina, and the men found a tobacco warehouse, and it was filled with chewing tobacco, and all of it was stamped with this bull's head that said Durham on it. Bull Durham tobacco, which know from that time. They'd never seen it, and they looted the warehouse and took all the tobacco. And the fellow who owned the place said, "Oh, woe is me, I've lost a whole bunch of money." But in fact, it was the first example of commercial sampling, because when Bull Durham tobacco was introduced in the North shortly after the war, it took off like a rocket because these people had already had a chance to sample it. So I don't know if he was able to write it off, but it really worked out well. The beginning of it, the end, as all of you know, was the siege of Petersburg and Richmond. The Northern Army got its lines around and kept extending those lines farther and further to the west and south of Petersburg. As they extended the lines, they continued rebuilding to build a railroad, so that each unit had its own railroad station and had its supplies come down by rail. They had a massive supply depot at Petersburg at a place called City Point, and they had the railroads running down out of City Point right down to right back up to the forts. Here's a good example of what the way that the North was technologically beating them. Those cars that you see, these were at Aquia Creek, Virginia, had been loaded probably in New Jersey or New York, and they were floated down there. You see the rails off on the side. They would slide the things over, line the rails up, roll the cars off, and the cars would immediately be taken down to the front lines where the ammunition, food, etc. was needed. Of course, the war ended with the railroad, on the railroad track at Appomattox Station. The reason why Lee had 2 trains of supplies waiting for him there and was trying to get to them. Just before he arrived, George Custer and the cavalry came swooping in, captured the trains, got the troops in front of the Confederates, and the war ended. How about time? I think that I'm going to stop there and...
War.